The trader's ship was an ugly thing, pieced together with rusted metal and buzzing with dim red lights. Captain Aiden Cross stepped through the narrow corridors, his boots echoing against the grated floor. He wasn't here for trouble, just supplies. But trouble often found him. He reached the ship's cargo hold, where a heavy stench of sweat and metal filled the air. Crates were stacked haphazardly, but something else caught his attention, a low, almost musical hum. Aiden turned the corner and froze. Inside a crude cage sat a woman. Her skin was pale lavender, shimmering faintly under the dim lights. Her long white hair was tangled, but it couldn't hide her piercing eyes that glared back at him like a cornered predator. She wore tattered fabric that barely covered her, and her hands gripped the iron bars, knuckles white with tension. "What's this?" Aiden demanded, his voice sharp as he faced the trader. The trader, a greasy man with a sly grin, shrugged. "Picked her up on Zoreth Prime. She's wild. Won't talk, won't eat unless forced. Thought someone might pay good credits for a unique pet." Aiden's jaw tightened. "She's not a pet. She's a person." The trader laughed, revealing yellowed teeth. "That's rich coming from a human. You think she'd do the same for you? She's dangerous. Better off cage." Aiden ignored him and crouched near the cage, keeping a respectful distance. The woman hissed, her sharp teeth flashing, but he didn't flinch. He noticed faint scars on her wrists, like she'd been restrained before. Her defiance, though, was unbroken. "Do you understand me?" Aiden asked, his tone softer. The woman didn't answer, but her eyes narrowed as if she was studying him. "Don't bother," the trader interjected. "She doesn't speak standard." Aiden straightened, his mind racing. He couldn't just leave her here. The trader would sell her to the highest bidder, and who knew what kind of fate awaited her. "I'll take her," Aiden said firmly. The trader's grin widened. "You? What'll you do with her?" "She's not some pet you can train, Captain." "That's none of your concern." "How much?" The trader named a price that made Aiden's stomach churn, but he didn't hesitate. A few minutes later, the cage was loaded onto his ship, the Stellar Vow. As his crew secured the cargo, Aiden couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just signed up for more trouble than he could handle. Once the woman was safely aboard, Aiden ordered the crew to leave her in the hold while he figured out his next move. She paced inside the cage like a restless predator, her sharp gaze tracking anyone who came near. "She's going to be a problem, Captain," said Kara, his second in command, folding her arms. "You sure about this?" "No," Aiden admitted, "but leaving her there wasn't an option. We'll figure it out." Later, Aiden approached the cage with a small tray of food and water. The woman watched him warily, her body tense. He placed the tray down and backed away slowly, giving her space. To his surprise, she stepped forward, sniffed the food, and then grabbed it with quick, almost graceful movements. "You've got fight in you," Aiden muttered, leaning against a nearby wall. "That's good. You're going to need it." The woman paused, her eyes locking onto his. For a moment, he thought he saw something: pain, anger, and maybe even understanding. Then she turned away, retreating to the corner of her cage. Aiden sighed, running a hand through his hair. He didn't know who she was, or where she came from, but one thing was clear: she wasn't ordinary. The Stellar Vow cruised silently through the dark void of space, its engines humming steadily. In the cargo hold, the woman paced the length of her cage like a caged predator. Aiden stood at a safe distance, watching her carefully. She still hadn't spoken a word, but her piercing gaze spoke volumes. "She doesn't trust us," Kara said as she joined him, arms crossed. "Can't blame her. Being caged like that, I'd probably be worse." "She's not just mistrustful. She's hiding something," Aiden replied, his eyes narrowing. "I just don't know what." Kara tilted her head. "You think she's dangerous?" Aiden chuckled dryly. "She overrode the trader's lock system in 2 seconds flat. Of course, she's dangerous." The woman suddenly stopped pacing and turned to face them. Her intense stare made Kara take a step back. Aiden, however, didn't move. He knelt slightly, meeting her gaze at eye level. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not your enemy." The woman didn't answer. Instead, she crouched in the corner of her cage, her expression unreadable. Aiden sighed and stood up. This was going nowhere. Later that day, Aiden made the decision to let her out of the cage. Kara protested, but Aiden waved her concerns aside. "We can't treat her like a prisoner if we want her to cooperate. I'll handle it." With the rest of the crew watching anxiously, Aiden unlocked the cage. The woman stepped out slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful. She stood tall, her chin raised defiantly, and looked around as if evaluating her surroundings. "Stay calm," Aiden said, holding up his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "You're free to move, but don't try anything stupid." The woman glanced at him briefly before walking toward a corner of the hold. Her steps were silent, almost predatory. The crew exchanged nervous glances but kept their distance. "She's not going to hurt anyone," Aiden assured them, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. That evening, Aiden tried once more to communicate. He brought a datapad loaded with translation software, hoping to bridge the language barrier. He sat down across from her and placed the device between them. "This is a translator," he explained, speaking slowly. "You talk, it understands. Maybe we can help each other." The woman stared at the device skeptically but didn't touch it. Instead, she pointed at the tray of food he brought earlier, then back at him. Her meaning was clear. "You want to know why I gave you food?" Aiden guessed. She nodded. "Because you're not my enemy," he said simply. "You've been treated like one, but I don't see it that way." For the first time, her expression softened slightly. She hesitated before finally picking up the datapad. Tentatively, she pressed a button and spoke in a language filled with sharp, melodic tones. The device whirred, processing her words, and then translated. "Why did you take me?" Aiden leaned forward. "Because you didn't deserve to be left there. Whoever you are, whatever you've done, you have a right to be free." Her gaze remained locked on him, as if searching for any sign of deceit. Then, unexpectedly, she nodded. She placed the datapad down and said a single word in her language, one the translator didn't need for context. "Lyra." Aiden smiled. "Lyra, is that your name?" She nodded again. "I'm Aiden," he said, gesturing to himself. For the first time, a flicker of understanding passed between them. Lyra's posture relaxed ever so slightly, and Aiden knew he'd taken the first step toward earning her trust. But as Lyra glanced toward the ship's windows, her expression darkened. Somewhere out there, her enemies were hunting her, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they found her. The stellar vow hummed quietly as it drifted through the vast expanse of space. Aiden sat at the ship's console, staring at the holographic map of their route. His thoughts, however, were elsewhere, on the strange woman now wandering cautiously through the ship. Lyra, that was her name. A name that matched her enigmatic presence. Kara's voice broke through his thoughts. "She's been poking around the engineering bay, Captain. Should I be worried?" Aiden glanced at her, smirking. "If she wanted to sabotage us, she could have done it already. Let her explore. Maybe she'll start trusting us. Or she's mapping the ship to take it over," Kara muttered, folding her arms. "I don't like this, Aiden." "She's not a threat," Aiden said firmly. "She's just lost." Lyra's bare feet padded softly against the metal floors as she explored the ship. Every corner seemed to fascinate her, though she made sure to avoid the curious eyes of the crew. When she entered the engineering bay, her eyes lit up at the sight of intricate machinery and glowing control panels. Her fingers hovered over a console, drawn to the blinking lights. "Careful," a voice said behind her. She spun around, startled, and saw Aiden standing in the doorway. He wasn't armed, and his stance was relaxed, but his sharp eyes observed her every move. "You know what this does?" he asked, nodding toward the console. Lyra hesitated before nodding. She gestured with her hands, mimicking the flow of energy, then tapped the side of her head. Aiden frowned, trying to piece it together. "You understand engineering," he guessed. "This is your language, isn't it? Machines, systems, they make sense to you." Lyra didn't answer directly, but her slight smile confirmed it. Aiden felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't just intelligent, she was skilled. If they could understand each other better, maybe she could help them. Later that day, Aiden brought Lyra to the common room. He had set up a table with various tools and gadgets, hoping to bridge their communication gap further. Lyra eyed the setup with suspicion, but eventually sat down across from him. "Let's try something different," Aiden said, picking up a small device. "This is a basic power modulator. Simple tech. Let's see if we can talk through it." He demonstrated how the device worked, then handed it to her. Lyra inspected it carefully, her slender fingers moving with precision. Within seconds, she dismantled the modulator and reassembled it, adding a small tweak that made the power flow more efficiently. Aiden let out a low whistle. "You're full of surprises." Lyra tilted her head, studying his reaction. For the first time, her guarded expression softened, and a faint smile played on her lips. She picked up another gadget, a broken communicator, and began working on it without hesitation. "You're brilliant," Aiden said, watching her work. "I bet you could teach our entire crew a thing or two." Lyra glanced up at him, her eyes wary but curious. She pressed a hand to her chest and said, "Lyra." Then she pointed at him. "Aiden," he replied, tapping his own chest. She repeated his name slowly, her voice melodic. "Aiden." Hearing her say his name made him grin. "That's right. We're getting somewhere." As the hours passed, Lyra's defenses began to lower. She spoke a few more words in her language, and Aiden used the translator to piece together what she meant. She was still cautious, but there was a hint of trust beginning to form between them. However, their moment of connection was interrupted by an alert. The ship's eye chimed, its voice monotone and calm. "Unidentified vessels approaching. Estimated contact, 5 minutes." Aiden's heart sank. He glanced at Lyra, whose expression turned grim. She stood abruptly, her body tense, and pointed toward the ship's windows. "They're here for you, aren't they?" Aiden asked, already knowing the answer. Lyra didn't need to say anything. Her eyes, filled with both fear and determination, told him everything. The air inside the stellar vow was heavy with tension. The approaching vessels were fast, and the crew scrambled to their positions. Aiden stood on the bridge, barking orders as the ship's systems lit up with warnings. 3 ships on an intercept course, Captain," Kara reported, her voice steady despite the rising panic. "They're scanning us." Aiden nodded, his jaw tightening. "Shields up. Divert power from non-essential systems. I don't want them taking a single look inside this ship." Lyra appeared in the doorway, her expression sharp and alert. Her eyes darted to the holographic display, showing the enemy ships closing in. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and pointed to the console. "You want to help?" Aiden asked, surprised. She nodded firmly, her hands making quick, precise gestures as she mimicked the ship's controls. "She knows what she's doing," Kara said, glancing at Aiden. "Let her try." Aiden hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside. "All right, Lyra. Show us what you've got." Lyra's hands flew across the console, her movements swift and confident. She bypassed several standard protocols, and within seconds, the ship's engines hummed louder, indicating an increase in power. "She just rerouted energy to the thrusters," Kara said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "We've got more speed." The approaching ships began hailing them, their harsh tones demanding surrender. Aiden ignored the calls, his focus on the display. "Can we outrun them?" he asked. Lyra shook her head and pointed to a section of the holographic map, a dense asteroid field not far from their current location. The asteroid field, Kara asked, frowning. That's suicide. She's right, Aiden said, nodding as he studied the map. It's our best chance. They won't risk following us in too deep. He turned to the crew. Set a course for the asteroid field. Full speed ahead. The stellar vow jolted as the engines roared to life, propelling the ship toward the asteroid field. Behind them, the enemy vessels opened fire, their laser blasts grazing the shields. The ship shuddered, and alarms blared throughout the bridge. Shields at 80%, Kara called out. We can't take too many hits like that. Aiden clenched his fists. Hold steady. Get us into that field. As they neared the asteroids, Lyra once again took control of the navigation system. Her eyes darted between the screen and the viewport, her fingers inputting precise commands. The ship weaved between massive rocks, narrowly avoiding collisions. She's insane, one of the crew members muttered, gripping their seat. But it's working. The pursuing ships hesitated at the edge of the field, their movements cautious. Aiden smirked. They're scared. Good. But the reprieve was short-lived. One of the enemy ships entered the field, its weapons locking onto the stellar vow. Brace for impact. Aiden shouted as a blast struck the rear of the ship. Sparks flew from the consoles, and the lights flickered. Damage to the aft thrusters, Kara reported. We're losing speed. Lyra jumped up from her seat and pointed toward the engineering bay, motioning urgently for Aiden to follow. You want to fix it? He asked. She nodded, her expression determined. Kara, you've got the bridge, Aiden ordered. Keep us alive. In the engineering bay, smoke filled the air as systems overloaded. Lyra worked quickly, her hands moving with precision as she repaired the damaged thrusters. Aiden stood by, watching in awe. She didn't need instructions. She seemed to understand the ship's technology intuitively. You're full of surprises, he muttered. Within minutes, the thrusters roared back to life. Lyra looked up at Aiden and nodded, her face streaked with soot but triumphant. We're back in the fight, he said, grinning. The stellar vow surged forward, dodging asteroids with renewed speed. The enemy ship that had followed them wasn't so lucky. It collided with a massive rock, exploding in a brilliant flash of light. The remaining two vessels pulled back, unwilling to risk further pursuit. As the stellar vow emerged from the asteroid field, the tension on the bridge eased. We did it, Kara said, exhaling deeply. We're clear. Aiden turned to Lyra, who stood beside him, her eyes scanning the screens. You saved us, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Thank you. Lyra didn't respond with words, but the faint smile on her lips spoke volumes. For the first time, Aiden felt like he was starting to understand her. But as the ship moved into safer space, a lingering thought gnawed at him. Whoever was chasing Lyra wasn't going to give up. This was only the beginning. The stellar vow cruised through safer space now, its engines steady and shields holding at minimal levels. The crew was exhausted but relieved. For the moment, they had escaped the pursuit. Aiden stood in the observation deck, staring out at the stars. His thoughts swirled around Lyra, the woman who had not only helped save the ship, but had done so with an expertise he hadn't expected. Behind him, Lyra's soft footsteps echoed as she entered the room. Aiden turned, meeting her gaze. She carried the translator device he had given her earlier, her expression unreadable but calm. You wanted to see me? She asked, her words slightly stilted but clear. Aiden was surprised by how quickly she was adapting to standard. Yes, Aiden said, gesturing for her to sit. You've proven you're not just a prisoner or someone who needs saving. You're skilled, probably more skilled than anyone on this ship, but I need to know the truth. Who are you really? Lyra hesitated, her eyes flickering to the stars outside the window. For a long moment, she seemed lost in thought. Finally, she sighed and sat down across from him, placing the translator on the table. I am not what you think, she began. Her voice carried a hint of sadness. I was not always in chains. I had a home, a purpose, but they took it from me. Aiden leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. Who are they? She hesitated again before answering. The ruling council of my people. They are corrupt, greedy. They fear those who speak the truth. I uncovered their lies, evidence that they were exploiting our world and its people for their gain. Aiden frowned. And they turned on you. She nodded. I was labeled a traitor, a danger to society. My uncle, who leads the council, had me imprisoned. I escaped with the help of those loyal to me, but they paid a heavy price. I've been hunted ever since. Aiden sat back, processing her words. So, you're some kind of whistleblower. Lyra tilted her head, not understanding the term. Aiden clarified. Someone who exposes corruption. Yes, she said simply. But more than that. I was the heir to my world's leadership. The weight of her words hung in the air. Aiden's eyes widened. Your royalty. Lyra looked away, her expression bitter. A title means nothing when your people have turned against you. I am nothing now, just a fugitive. Aiden stood and began pacing. So let me get this straight. You're the rightful leader of your world, but your uncle staged a coup, branded you a criminal, and now he's using the Empire's forces to hunt you down. Lyra nodded, her expression resigned. That is correct. That explains why they were so desperate to capture you, Aiden muttered, running a hand through his hair. But why didn't you tell me this before? I did not trust you, Lyra admitted. I still don't, entirely. Trust is not easily given when betrayal has been my only companion. Her words stung, but Aiden understood. He couldn't imagine the pain she must have endured. He sat back down, meeting her gaze. Well, you're not alone anymore. We'll help you. Lyra's eyes softened, though her voice remained cautious. Why? Why would you risk yourself and your crew for someone like me? Aiden smiled faintly. Because it's the right thing to do. And honestly, I've seen enough injustice in the galaxy to know when someone's worth fighting for. Lyra didn't respond immediately, but for the first time, Aiden thought he saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She stood, placing the translator in her pocket. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Aiden could reply, Kara's voice crackled over the comms. Captain, you need to get to the bridge. We've picked up a signal, and it's heading straight for us. Aiden and Lyra exchanged a look. The reprieve was over. Whoever was hunting Lyra wasn't far behind. And this time, Aiden knew they wouldn't back off without a fight. The atmosphere on the Stellar Vow was tense as Aiden stepped onto the bridge. Kara and the rest of the crew were already at their stations, eyes glued to the monitors. Lyra followed closely behind, her expression calm, but her sharp gaze betraying her unease. What do we have? Aiden asked, his tone steady. Kara turned to him, her face grim. It's a battleship, bigger than anything we can handle. They're scanning the area, probably looking for us. Aiden clenched his jaw. The enemy was relentless. How far are they? About 30 minutes away, Kara replied. We can't outrun them this time. Aiden glanced at Lyra. She stood silently, staring at the display of the approaching battleship. Any ideas? He asked. Lyra didn't respond immediately. Her mind seemed to be racing as she studied the situation. Then, finally, she spoke. We don't run. We outthink them. The crew exchanged skeptical glances, but Aiden nodded. What are you suggesting? Lyra stepped forward, pointing to the holographic map of the area. There is a nearby asteroid cluster, dense enough to hide us temporarily. But hiding isn't enough. We need a distraction. Kara frowned. A distraction? Like what? Lyra's eyes narrowed, her voice firm. We create a false signature. Make them think we've escaped in another direction. They'll chase it while we slip past. Aiden raised an eyebrow. You can do that. Lyra nodded. Yes, but I'll need access to your communication array and your spare power cores. Kara crossed her arms. That's risky. If they figure it out, they'll know exactly where we are. It's better than waiting for them to catch us, Aiden said, his decision made. Lyra, you have what you need. Kara, help her get it done. Kara hesitated but eventually nodded. Fine. But if this backfires, I'm blaming both of you. In the engineering bay, Lyra worked quickly, her hands moving with precision as she modified one of the ship's power cores. Kara hovered nearby, watching with a mixture of suspicion and awe. You're pretty handy with this stuff, Kara admitted reluctantly. Where'd you learn all this? Lyra didn't look up as she replied. My people value knowledge. Science and engineering are as vital as breath to us. I was trained from a young age. Kara raised an eyebrow. Royalty and a tech genius. You don't make it easy to hate you. Lyra glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I'll take that as a compliment. Back on the bridge, Aiden monitored their progress. The enemy battleship was getting closer, its massive form cutting through the void like a predator hunting prey. Status? Aiden asked over the comm. Almost ready, Lyra replied. Give me 2 minutes. The seconds ticked by painfully slowly. Aiden tapped his fingers on the console, his gaze flicking between the timer and the enemy's position. Finally, Lyra's voice came through again. It's done. Activating the signal now. A moment later, a new blip appeared on the radar, heading in the opposite direction of the stellar vow. The enemy ship hesitated, then adjusted its course to follow the false signature. They're taking the bait, Kara said, relief evident in her voice. It's working. Aiden let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Good. Get us into that asteroid cluster and keep us hidden until they're out of range. As the ship slipped into the dense field of asteroids, Aiden turned to Lyra. She was leaning against a console, clearly exhausted but determined. You did good, he said, his voice sincere. Lyra met his gaze, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. We're not safe yet. Aiden nodded. I know, but you bought us time. And sometimes time is all we need. The tension eased slightly as the ship disappeared into the cover of the asteroid cluster. But Aiden knew Lyra was right. This wasn't over. The battleship would return, and when it did, they needed to be ready. The asteroid cluster provided a brief respite for the stellar vow. The crew moved quickly to repair damage and recharge the ship's systems while staying hidden. Aiden sat in the conference room, studying the holographic map of their position. Across from him, Lyra leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes scanning every detail on the display. We can't stay here forever, Aiden said, breaking the silence. Lyra nodded. They will sweep back through this area eventually. We need a plan to disable them, or escape completely. Aiden rubbed his temples. You're asking for a miracle. Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. You humans are known for surprising the galaxy with your so-called miracles. Before Aiden could respond, the ship's intercom crackled to life. Kara's voice came through, tense and hurried. Captain, we have a problem. Get to the bridge. Now. Aiden and Lyra exchanged a glance before hurrying out of the room. When they reached the bridge, Kara was standing over a console, her face pale. What's going on? Aiden demanded. Kara pointed to the radar display. A signal just went out from our ship. Someone sent our location to the enemy. The realization hit Aiden like a punch to the gut. What? How is that possible? Who ruled? He froze as his eyes landed on one of his crew members, a wiry man named Vance, standing near the door with a guilty expression. The rest of the crew backed away from him, their hands hovering near their sidearms. Vance, Aiden said, his voice low and dangerous. Tell me you didn't just do what I think you did. Vance swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Aiden and Lyra. I didn't have a choice, Captain. They offered me a way out, a way to protect my family. They said if I gave them her, he pointed at Lyra, they'd leave us alone. You betrayed us, Kara hissed, stepping toward him. You put all our lives at risk. I did it to save lives, Vance shouted. If they catch us, we're dead anyway. At least this way, some of us might survive. Aiden's fists clenched. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but there was no time. The proximity alarm blared, signaling the arrival of the enemy battleship. On the radar, the massive ship was closing in fast. They're here, Kara said, her voice grim. We've got minutes, maybe less. Lyra stepped forward, her expression calm despite the chaos. We can still escape, but I'll need your trust. Aiden glanced at her, his anger fading under the weight of urgency. What do you need? She pointed to the engineering bay. If we overload the asteroid cluster with an energy pulse, it will create a debris field strong enough to blind their sensors. But we have to act fast. That could blow us up too, Kara warned. It's a risk, Lyra admitted, but it's our only chance. Aiden nodded. Do it. Kara, take Vance to the brig. We'll deal with him later. Vance didn't resist as Kara dragged him away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Aiden turned to the rest of the crew. Everyone else, get ready. This is going to be rough. In the engineering bay, Lyra worked frantically to modify the ship's power core. Aiden stood beside her, watching as she rerouted energy and connected circuits with precision. The ship trembled as enemy fire began hitting the asteroid field, but Lyra didn't falter. Almost there, she muttered. Hurry, Aiden urged. They're closing in. Finally, Lyra stepped back. It's ready. Once we activate the pulse, we'll have a small window to escape. Aiden nodded. Let's make it count. Back on the bridge, Lyra activated the pulse. A blinding wave of energy erupted from the ship, sending asteroids spinning in every direction. The enemy battleship disappeared from the radar as its sensors were overwhelmed. Engines at full power, Aiden shouted. Get us out of here. The stellar vow surged forward, weaving through the chaos. The crew held their breath as debris slammed into the shields, but the ship pushed through. Finally, the radar cleared, and the battleship was nowhere in sight. The crew let out a collective sigh of relief. As the ship sailed into open space, Aiden turned to Lyra. You saved us. Again. Lyra shook her head. It was your decision to trust me. That's what saved us. Aiden smiled faintly, but his expression darkened as he thought of Vance. We've got a lot to sort out, but for now, we live to fight another day. Lyra nodded, and the fight isn't over. The stellar vow drifted through calm space, far from the asteroid field and the enemy battleship. The crew was exhausted, but a cautious sense of relief had settled over them. Aiden stood in the brig, staring at Vance through the reinforced glass. The man looked down, unable to meet his captain's eyes. You betrayed us, Vance, Aiden said, his voice cold. You almost got us killed. Vance finally looked up, his eyes filled with guilt. I thought I was doing the right thing. They threatened my family, Captain. I didn't know what else to do. Aiden's jaw tightened. You put the entire crew at risk. That's not something I can forgive easily. Vance's shoulders sagged. Do what you have to. I deserve it. Aiden said nothing more. He turned and left, his mind already focused on the bigger threat looming over them. In the conference room, Lyra and Kara were reviewing the data collected from their escape. Lyra's expression was grim as she pointed to the readings on the screen. They're not going to stop, Lyra said. The Empire has too much at stake. My uncle won't rest until he's silenced me. Kara frowned. We can't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they'll corner us. That's why we don't run, Aiden said as he entered the room. Both women turned to him, surprised by the determination in his voice. What do you mean? Lyra asked. We take the fight to them, Aiden said. We expose your uncle and his corruption. If we can show the truth to your people, we can turn the tide. Lyra hesitated. That's not a simple task. My uncle controls the media, the military, and the council. He's silenced anyone who opposes him. But he hasn't silenced you, Aiden said. And now you have us. If we can broadcast your story to your people, they'll listen. They deserve to know the truth. Lyra stared at him, her expression a mixture of doubt and hope. It's risky. If we fail. We won't, Aiden interrupted. Because we can't. The plan was simple in theory but dangerous in execution. The Stellar Vow would infiltrate a communications hub controlled by the Empire. Once inside, Lyra would broadcast a message to her people, revealing the Council's corruption and her uncle's betrayal. It was a long shot, but it was their only chance. As the ship approached the hub, the crew prepared for the mission. Aiden stood in the cargo bay, checking his gear. Lyra approached, her expression serious. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. This isn't your fight. Aiden looked at her, his eyes unwavering. It is now. If we don't stand up to people like your uncle, the galaxy will never change. Lyra nodded, her respect for Aiden growing. Thank you. The infiltration began smoothly. The Stellar Vow used its stealth systems to dock undetected, and Aiden led a small team, including Lyra, into the heart of the hub. They moved quickly, avoiding patrols and disabling security systems as they went. Finally, they reached the control room. Lyra immediately began working on the terminal, her fingers flying across the keys. Aiden and the others stood guard, their weapons ready. Hurry up, Kara whispered, her eyes scanning the hallway. We've got company. I'm almost there, Lyra said, her voice steady. Just a few more seconds. Suddenly, alarms blared. The room was bathed in red light as the enemy forces discovered their presence. Aiden cursed under his breath. They're coming, Kara shouted. Keep them off me, Lyra said, her focus unshaken. Aiden and Kara took positions by the door, firing at the soldiers who poured into the hallway. The firefight was intense, but Aiden's determination kept him steady. Got it, Lyra exclaimed. She pressed a final button, and a holographic image of her appeared on every screen in the hub and across her home planet. My name is Lyra, her voice echoed. I am the rightful heir to our world, and I bring you the truth. The broadcast reached millions. Lyra's words exposed the Council's corruption and her uncle's betrayal, sparking unrest among the people. Though the enemy soldiers were closing in, Aiden knew they had succeeded in lighting the spark of rebellion. Time to go, he shouted. The team retreated to the Stellar Vow, narrowly escaping as the communications hub erupted into chaos. As they sped away, Lyra stood on the bridge, watching her planet grow smaller on the screen. It started, she said quietly. Aiden nodded. And we'll see it through. The Stellar Vow cruised through the darkness of space, battered but victorious. Aiden stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the holographic display of Lyra's home planet. Reports from the surface were flooding in. Protests were breaking out in major cities, the Council's forces were losing control, and whispers of rebellion were growing louder. Lyra stood beside him, her arms crossed and her expression thoughtful. It's not over, she said quietly. The Council still has loyalists, and my uncle won't give up power so easily. Aiden nodded. Maybe, but you gave your people hope. That's more than they've had in a long time. Kara entered the bridge, holding a datapad. Captain, we've picked up a transmission. It's from the Resistance on Lyra's planet. They want to talk. Aiden exchanged a glance with Lyra. Let's hear it. Kara pressed a button, and a crackling voice filled the bridge. This is Commander Varric of the Free Lyrian Movement. We received your broadcast, and the people are rallying to your cause. The Council is weakening, but we need leadership, Princess Lyra. Your people need you. Lyra's breath caught at the title she hadn't heard in so long. She looked at Aiden, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. This is Lyra, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. I'll return to lead my people, but we'll need your help to end this peacefully. Too much blood has already been spilled. "We'll do what we can," Varric replied. "But the Council's forces are regrouping. We'll need to act quickly." The transmission ended, and the bridge fell silent. Aiden turned to Lyra. "Looks like you've got a war to finish." The crew worked tirelessly to prepare the stellar vow for the next stage of the fight. Supplies were restocked, weapons were calibrated, and the ship's systems were optimized for combat. Aiden called the crew together in the common room for a final briefing. "Listen up," he began, his voice firm. "We're heading back to Lyra's planet. This isn't just for fight. It's ours now. The Council has ruled through fear and corruption for too long. It's time to help her people take their world back." The crew nodded, their faces set with determination. Even Vance, who had been released from the break, stood quietly at the back, his guilt evident. He had begged for a chance to redeem himself, and Aiden had reluctantly agreed. "This is dangerous," Aiden continued. "If anyone wants out, now's your chance." No one moved. "Good," Aiden said, his lips curling into a small smile. "Let's do this." The stellar vow descended into Lyra's planet's atmosphere, dodging fire from the Council's remaining forces. Resistance fighters guided them to a hidden base in the mountains, where Lyra was met with cheers and reverence. Aiden watched as Lyra addressed the growing crowd. Her voice was strong, her words inspiring. She spoke of unity, justice, and a future free from corruption. For the first time, Aiden saw her not just as a fugitive or a survivor, but as a true leader. The final battle was swift but decisive. With the resistance bolstered by Lyra's return, the Council's forces crumbled. Her uncle was captured, and his crimes were broadcast to the entire planet. The people demanded justice, and for the first time in years, they saw hope for a better future. Back on the stellar vow, Lyra stood with Aiden on the observation deck. The planet below glowed softly, its cities no longer consumed by fear. "I can't thank you enough," Lyra said. "You didn't have to help me, but you did. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Aiden shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. Sometimes all it takes is someone to remind you of who you really are. Lyra reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You'll always have a place here, if you ever want to stay." Aiden shook his head. "I've got my own path to follow, but I'll be watching. And if you ever need me, you know where to find me." Lyra nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you, Aiden, for everything." As the stellar vow lifted off, leaving the planet behind, Aiden couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had made a difference, something few could say in a galaxy as vast and unforgiving as this one. And as he looked out at the stars, he knew this was just the beginning of many more adventures to come.